The daycare teacher said my husband picked our daughter up early twice a week. I just found out what he was doing with her. I stared at her in total confusion because he never got home with our daughter before 5:30. Are you sure? I asked. The teacher pulled out her attendance log and showed me 8 weeks of pickups I knew nothing about. I left the daycare and sat in my car Googling Chris's office number, calling his department directly. His coworker laughed when I asked for Chris, saying he'd only worked mornings on Tuesdays and Thursdays for months. I called in sick to work and drove home and searched through his things, finding receipts from stores I didn't recognize, charges at restaurants during times he was supposedly at work, Tuesday lunch at Chuck E. Cheese, Thursday afternoon at Build-A-Bear, places you take a child. Sophie had been singing this song lately about Mama Jess and baby brother that I'd thought was from cartoons. I recognized the street name from Chris's company directory as where Jessica lived, the new marketing manager. When Chris got home, I had everything spread across the kitchen table and told him I knew about the pickups. He didn't even try to deny it, just sat down and admitted he'd been taking Sophie to Jessica's apartment twice a week for 2 months. While I thought our daughter was at daycare, she'd been at another woman's home playing house. Jessica had set up a pink bedroom just for Sophie, bought her clothes and toys, been teaching our 3-year-old to call her Mama Jess. But it was worse than an affair because Jessica was 4 months pregnant with Chris's baby. The timing made me sick because 4 months ago I was in the middle of IVF treatments that we'd spent $20,000 on. He'd watched me inject myself with hormones every morning, held my hand through the egg retrievals, comforted me through 3 failed cycles, all while his girlfriend was already pregnant. They'd been using Sophie as practice for their new family, and our daughter had been helping them decorate a nursery, picking out dinosaur wallpaper for her baby brother's room. Chris showed me photos on his phone of Sophie at Jessica's apartment, eating lunch Jessica made, napping in the pink bed, playing with toys I'd never seen. 32 days over 2 months where my daughter was bonding with my replacement while I worked to support us. They'd enrolled Sophie in a Montessori school near Jessica's apartment without telling me, had toured it together like a real family. Jessica's lease was up next month, and they'd already put an offer on a house with a room for Sophie, a nursery for the baby, and a master bedroom for them. Sophie asked if she could live there. Chris said, she wants to be with the baby. The cruelty of turning my daughter against me by giving her a sibling through another woman was breathtaking. While I'd been crying over negative pregnancy tests, Jessica was taking Sophie to her prenatal appointments, letting her hear the baby's heartbeat, making her an accomplice in this betrayal. Chris pulled out a folder with emails to a divorce lawyer from 3 weeks ago, where he'd been asking about custody and establishing Jessica as an existing caregiver. The Tuesday-Thursday pattern wasn't random, but strategic documentation for court. Every pickup had been logged, every receipt saved, every photo time-stamped to show Jessica as a consistent maternal presence in Sophie's life. She's a better mother than you, Chris said flatly. Sophie doesn't have tantrums with her, actually eats vegetables, goes to bed without crying. Every normal parenting struggle I'd ever had was being weaponized against me. My own mother had known for a month because Chris had needed someone to help with pickups when he had real meetings. She'd been dropping Sophie at Jessica's apartment, had met the woman replacing me, had seen the nursery being built for the grandchild that wasn't mine. Your mom agrees this is best, Chris said. Sophie needs stability. 2 parents, a sibling, not whatever this is. He gestured around our small rental house like it was proof of my failure. The papers I'd signed last month thinking they were for his insurance had actually been removing me from our car loans, our joint accounts, everything except the credit card debt. They'd planned this takeover of my life so carefully that Sophie now cried when she had to leave Jessica's house, asked when she could go back to the pink room, wanted Mama Jess to read her bedtime stories instead of me. I told him he couldn't just steal our daughter, but we both knew he'd already been doing exactly that for months. Chris grabbed his keys and headed for the door, announcing he was staying at Jessica's tonight. Sophie's coming with me, he said casually. I just told your mom the jig's up, so she said she'll pick her up and bring her by Jessica's. My own mother was helping him, was in on this betrayal, delivering my daughter to another woman's arms. She agrees that Jessica's more stable, Chris said at the door. Sophie needs a real family with 2 parents and a sibling, not a broke single mother. Jessica's moving in next week. You should start looking for an apartment. I stood there frozen as he walked out with his overnight bag, and through the window I watched him throw Sophie's favorite stuffed dinosaur into his car, the purple one she couldn't sleep without. My hands shook so bad I could barely hold my phone as it hit me that he was really taking her tonight, and my own mother was driving over right now to help him do it. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts looking for that lawyer my coworker Sarah mentioned last month when her sister went through her divorce. Serena Ashworth picked up even though it was after 8, and when I explained what was happening right now, she told me to document everything with photos and notes. She said to record anything I could legally record and write down every single thing Chris had admitted tonight while it was still fresh. I started taking pictures of everything Chris had left spread across the kitchen table, all his evidence of taking Sophie to Jessica's, the receipts and logs and emails to his divorce lawyer. My hands were still shaking, but I forced myself to photograph every page, every receipt, making sure the dates and times were clear. Then I heard my mother's car in the driveway, and she walked in without knocking like she owned the place. Avoiding eye contact as she headed straight for Sophie's room, I followed her with my phone recording, watching her pack Sophie's overnight bag with clothes and toys like this was totally normal. When I asked her how she could do this to me, she just kept packing and said Jessica was more stable, and it was what's best for Sophie. She said I was too stressed from work and the failed IVF to be a good mother right now, that Sophie needed consistency and 2 parents who weren't fighting all the time. Sophie came out of her room confused and scared, rubbing her eyes and asking why Grandma was packing her things in the middle of bedtime. My mother told her she was having a special sleepover at Daddy and Mama Jess's new house, and I had to bite my tongue hard to keep from screaming the truth about what was really happening. Sophie started crying that she wanted to stay with me, reaching for me, but my mother picked her up and carried her toward the door saying Daddy was waiting. I followed them outside trying to comfort Sophie without making things worse, telling her I loved her and would see her soon, even though I had no idea when Chris would let me see her again. After they drove away with Sophie crying for me in the back seat, pressing her little face against the window, I went back inside and photographed everything Chris had left on the table again from different angles. I opened my laptop and created a new document, typing out every single detail I could remember about the past 2 months while the betrayal was still burning fresh in my mind. I wrote about the Tuesday-Thursday pattern, the daycare pickups I never knew about, Chris only working mornings, my mother helping him, Jessica's pregnancy timing with our IVF treatments. I documented Sophie's songs about Mama Jess and baby brother, the pink bedroom, the Montessori school enrollment, the house they'd put an offer on, everything Chris had thrown in my face tonight. I stayed up all night organizing everything into folders on my computer, scanning the receipts, organizing the daycare logs, saving the screenshots I'd managed to grab from Chris's phone before he left. I made folders for each week, cross-referencing dates with my work calendar to show I'd been at the office while Chris was taking Sophie to Jessica's apartment. By morning, I had a comprehensive file showing exactly how they'd planned this whole thing, how systematic and deliberate their plan to steal my daughter had been. At 7 sharp, I was standing outside the bank when they unlocked the doors and I went straight to a teller to move my direct deposit to a new account only I could access. The teller looked concerned when I explained I needed to protect my paycheck from my husband, but she helped me set up the new account and transfer everything except the minimum to keep the joint account open. She showed me how to remove Chris's access to any new accounts and helped me update my work's direct deposit information right there at her desk. Then I sat in my car and called the daycare, asking to speak with the director about adding security to Sophie's file. I added a password that had to be given before any changes could be made, specifically removing Chris's ability to change anything without my consent. The director told me Chris had actually tried to withdraw Sophie completely last month, but couldn't because he needed both parents' signatures for that. She said she'd been wondering why Chris had been asking about their withdrawal policies, and now it made sense, and she promised to document everything for me. At 9, I was sitting in Serena's office going through everything while she took notes and asked questions about specific dates and times. I wonder what Chris was thinking during those months of planning. Did he really believe Sophie would just forget about her actual mother? The way he documented everything so carefully while watching his wife go through IVF treatments makes me curious about when exactly he decided this was his plan. We spent 3 hours going through every single piece of evidence, with Serena explaining that Chris's own documentation actually helped us because it showed deliberate deception. She said judges really don't like it when one parent makes major decisions about a child's care without telling the other parent, especially when it involves another adult the child is calling mama. She explained that establishing Jessica as a caregiver without my knowledge or consent was actually a form of parental alienation, and the fact that they'd enrolled Sophie in a different school showed they were planning to cut me out completely. We worked together drafting an emergency motion for temporary custody orders, emphasizing how Chris had unilaterally made huge decisions about Sophie's care without my knowledge or consent for 2 whole months. Serena said we needed to file immediately before Chris could establish Jessica's house as Sophie's primary residence, because once that happened, it would be much harder to get her back. Right then, my phone buzzed with an email from Mike Barkley at Chris's office, and I opened it while Serena was still organizing papers. Mike had responded to my earlier message with the exact confirmation I needed, forwarding me the official schedule change form Chris had submitted 4 months ago, requesting to work only Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The form showed Chris's signature and his manager's approval stamp dated back when I was starting my second round of IVF shots. Serena grabbed the phone from my hand and immediately printed 3 copies of the email, highlighting the dates and adding it to our evidence folder. She told me to call my mother right now while we had momentum and handed me her office phone, explaining that our state allowed single-party consent for recording conversations. My hands shook as I dialed my mother's number, and Serena pressed the record button on her computer when my mother picked up. I kept my voice steady and asked her directly how long she'd been helping Chris take Sophie to Jessica's apartment. My mother sighed and admitted she'd been doing it for a month because she thought I was too stressed from work and the IVF treatments to be a good mother right now. She actually said Jessica seemed more stable and that Sophie was happier there with the pink bedroom and all the new toys. I asked her if she thought it was okay to lie to me about where my daughter was, and she said sometimes people need help even when they don't know it. Serena was typing notes as my mother kept talking, explaining how Jessica had everything organized, and Sophie never cried there like she did at home with me. When I hung up, Serena saved the recording and made backup copies on 2 different drives, saying this was exactly the kind of evidence we needed to show bias and deception. That night, I couldn't sleep at all, so I opened my laptop and started creating a detailed spreadsheet of every single time I could remember Chris lying about where he was. I went through my calendar, my texts, my bank statements, matching dates and times with what Chris had told me versus what I now knew was true. The pattern went back way further than 2 months because I found restaurant charges from 6 months ago when Jessica first started at his company. There were afternoon coffee purchases near her apartment when he was supposedly in meetings, weekend hardware store trips when we didn't do any home projects, movie tickets for 2 when he said he was working late. By 4 in the morning, I had 63 instances documented with dates, times, and evidence, and the pattern was so clear it made me sick. Monday morning, Serena met me at the courthouse at 8 sharp, and we filed the emergency motion with the clerk who stamped it and gave us a case number. The clerk said we'd get a hearing date within the week and handed us the paperwork showing Chris would be served within 24 hours. Serena warned me that once Chris got served, he would probably retaliate and try to make things worse, so I needed to stay calm no matter what he did or said. She gave me her cell number and told me to document everything, but not engage with him directly, just forward everything to her. That afternoon, Brianna Ashby from the daycare called to say she'd completed the sworn statement Serena had requested about the pickup patterns. She was faxing over copies of the attendance logs showing exactly when Chris picked up Sophie versus when he'd told me she was at daycare, and she'd highlighted all the discrepancies in yellow marker. Brianna also included notes about Chris's attempts to change Sophie's enrollment without my permission and how he'd asked about withdrawal policies multiple times. She said she'd been keeping detailed notes because something had seemed off about the whole situation, and now she understood why. Friday came, and it was my first scheduled visitation with Sophie since Chris had taken her to Jessica's house. When I picked her up at the daycare, she immediately asked where Mama Jess was and when she could go back to see the baby's room. She kept talking about the dinosaur wallpaper and the new toys and asking if we could go there instead of going home. I stayed calm and redirected her to the playground, pushing her on the swings while my heart broke into pieces listening to her talk about Jessica's pancakes and the pink bed. Sophie asked 3 more times during our afternoon together when she could see the baby, and I just kept saying maybe later and changing the subject. Monday, I had my first therapy session with Dennis Barnard, and I completely fell apart in his office talking about the IVF failures. I told him about the $20,000 we'd spent, the daily hormone injections, the 3 failed cycles, all while Chris was already getting Jessica pregnant. Dennis handed me tissues as I sobbed about the cruelty of it, how Chris had held my hand during the egg retrievals and comforted me after each negative negative test knowing his girlfriend was carrying his baby. He helped me understand that this level of deception wasn't my fault, and that my rage was completely justified. He gave me breathing exercises to use when the anger felt overwhelming, and scheduled me for twice weekly sessions to help me process everything. Meanwhile, Serena was filing additional documentation with the court about Chris hiding assets and making financial decisions without my knowledge. She submitted copies of the insurance papers I'd signed thinking they were routine updates, but were actually removing me from our car loans and joint accounts. She showed the pattern of deception went beyond just the affair and custody issues to include financial manipulation designed to leave me with nothing but debt. At work, I finally had to tell my boss why I needed time off for court hearings because I couldn't keep calling in sick. She called me into her office and I explained the basics of what was happening with Chris and Sophie. To my surprise, she was incredibly supportive, immediately offering to let me work from home when needed and adjust my schedule around court dates. She told me she'd gone through something similar 5 years ago and knew how impossible it was to focus on spreadsheets when your whole life was falling apart. She even gave me the name of her lawyer in case I needed a second opinion and told me to take whatever time I needed. By Thursday, Chris started his retaliation campaign by sending emails with photos of Sophie at Jessica's house, showing her playing in the pink bedroom and eating dinner at Jessica's table. Each email had captions about how happy Sophie looked and how she'd asked to stay there instead of coming home with me. Serena reviewed each one and helped me write neutral responses that just said received without engaging in his obvious attempts to make me angry. She explained that judges could see through this kind of manipulation, and it would actually help our case to show his pattern of provocation. I forwarded everything to Serena, and she added it to our growing file of evidence showing Chris's attempts to alienate Sophie from me and provoke me into an emotional response that he could use against me in court. Serena called Monday morning saying the mediation was set for next week, and we needed to prep hard because Chris would try to paint me as unstable. She had me come to her office that afternoon where we spent 3 hours going over every possible question they might ask. She told me Jessica would definitely be there to intimidate me, probably wearing something that showed off her pregnant belly to remind everyone she was giving Sophie a sibling. I had to practice staying calm when they called Sophie our daughter and not correcting them when Jessica acted like Sophie's mother. Serena made me repeat facts without emotion over and over until I could say them without my voice shaking. Meanwhile, I spent every evening that week looking at apartments because Chris kept texting that I needed to be out by the end of the month. The first place I toured was in a rough neighborhood with broken glass in the parking lot and police sirens going off while the landlord showed me around. The second apartment had mold in the bathroom and bars on the windows, but it was all I could afford on my salary alone. The third place was 40 minutes from Sophie's daycare, which would mean waking her up at 5 in the morning just to get her there on time. The fourth apartment was above a bar, and the music was so loud during the tour I couldn't hear the property manager talking. By Friday, I finally found a small studio that was clean and safe and still in Sophie's school district. It was tiny, just one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but the landlord said kids were allowed and it was month to month so I could move if I found something better. I signed the lease that day, even though it meant Sophie would have to sleep on a pull-out couch when she stayed with me. Something about Serena's confidence makes me wonder. She's acting like this is all wrapped up already, but custody battles are messy. The way she keeps saying Chris is helping their case feels too neat. Wednesday's mediation was exactly what Serena warned me about. Jessica sat right next to Chris with her hand on her belly the whole time, wearing a tight dress that made her pregnancy super obvious. They came in holding hands and Chris pulled out her chair like they were some perfect couple. When the mediator asked about custody arrangements, Jessica actually spoke up, saying she'd been Sophie's primary caregiver for months. She called herself Sophie's real mother and said I was just the biological parent who couldn't provide stability. I wrote down every word on the legal pad Serena gave me instead of screaming that she'd stolen my daughter. Chris showed photos of Sophie's pink bedroom at Jessica's apartment and talked about the nursery they were building for the baby. He said Sophie was excited about being a big sister and had helped pick out the crib. The mediator asked about my living situation, and I had to admit I was moving to a studio apartment while Chris described their new 4-bedroom house with a backyard and swing set. When they suggested I should only have supervised visits, Serena finally spoke up with our documentation showing Chris's deception and financial manipulation. The emergency hearing happened 2 days later, way faster than we expected. The judge was an older woman who looked annoyed from the start, especially when Chris's lawyer tried to argue that I was being vindictive. She reviewed our emergency motion while we sat there in silence for what felt like forever. Then she looked directly at Chris and asked why he'd been making major decisions about Sophie without informing me. His lawyer tried to spin it as him being the more involved parent, but the judge cut him off. She ordered that Chris couldn't change Sophie's school or daycare without my written consent and set up a temporary schedule giving me Sophie Thursday through Sunday. She also ordered that all exchanges had to happen at the daycare with no direct contact between Chris and me. Jessica actually gasped when the judge said she wasn't allowed at the exchanges. Best of all, the judge appointed someone called a guardian ad litem to figure out what was actually best for Sophie instead of just listening to Chris's lies. Her name was Gabrielle Appel, and she'd be interviewing everyone and making recommendations to the court. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone might actually see the truth instead of just believing Chris's story about me being an unfit mother. Gabrielle called me the next Monday to set up our first interview. She came to my new studio apartment and I showed her everything. The timeline I'd created, all the receipts and documentation, the emails showing Chris's deception. She took notes about everything, especially the fact that Sophie had been taken to Jessica's apartment for 2 months without my knowledge. She asked about Sophie's behavior changes, and I told her about the accidents and nightmares and how Sophie kept asking for Mama Jess. Gabrielle wrote it all down without judgment, just asking follow-up questions to understand the full picture. She spent 2 hours with me and said she'd be observing Sophie during exchanges and interviewing Chris and Jessica next. When Gabrielle interviewed them, according to what she told me later, they gave her a full tour of the pink bedroom and nursery, but she asked pointed questions they weren't ready for, like why they hadn't included me in decisions about Sophie's education, and why they thought it was appropriate to have Sophie call Jessica Mama. She told me Chris got defensive when she asked about the financial papers he'd tricked me into signing. 2 weeks later, my mother showed up at daycare during my pickup time, trying to take Sophie. The daycare director called me confused because my mother was insisting Chris had sent her. I drove there immediately and found my mother arguing with the staff that she had a right to take her granddaughter. I had to call the police to document it because she wouldn't leave. The officer explained to her that she had no legal right to take Sophie during my custody time and made her leave the property. Sophie was crying and confused about why Grandma and Mommy were fighting. That night, I had an emergency session with Dennis to process what happened. He helped me understand that my mother's betrayal hurt almost as much as Chris's because she was supposed to be on my side. We talked about how she'd chosen them over me and how I needed to protect myself from her manipulation. Dennis said setting boundaries was essential for my mental health, even if it meant cutting off my only family support. The next morning, I sent my mother a text saying I needed space and wouldn't be responding to her messages for now. My hands shook as I hit send because she was literally the only family I had left besides Sophie. But Dennis was right that I couldn't let her keep hurting me while I was trying to rebuild my life. She immediately started calling and texting, saying I was being dramatic and that she was just trying to help, but I didn't respond to any of it. 3 days later, Chris texted me that I needed to return the car keys since my name wasn't on the loan anymore. I drove to the daycare that morning and handed them over, watching him smirk as he took them. The bus ride home took an hour and a half with 2 transfers, and I had to walk the last mile in the rain. I started documenting every single difficulty this created, taking photos of the bus stops and keeping receipts for every Uber I had to take. When I told my boss about the car situation, she immediately adjusted my schedule to work around the bus routes. My coworkers started a rotation to help with rides to court and daycare pickups. One of them even gave me her old bike, so I could get to the grocery store easier. Their support meant everything when my own family had completely abandoned me. Gabriel scheduled a home visit to my new studio apartment the following week. I spent days organizing Sophie's corner, making sure all her toys and books were displayed nicely. The apartment was tiny, but I'd made it clean and safe, keeping all of Sophie's routines exactly the same. Gabriel took notes about everything, measuring the space and checking the locks on the windows. She asked about Sophie's schedule, and I showed her the chart I'd made with bedtimes and meal plans. She seemed impressed that I'd maintained such consistency despite everything falling apart around us. That weekend, I gathered all my IVF records for Serena, spreading them across my tiny kitchen table. The dates made me sick when I compared them to when Jessica got pregnant. $20,000 and dozens of painful injections while Chris was already making a baby with someone else. I had to take breaks to cry in the bathroom, but I organized everything into a binder for court. The medical bills alone showed how committed I'd been to having another child with Chris. Meanwhile, Jessica had gotten pregnant for free while I was paying for failed treatments. Sophie came back from Chris's house that Sunday talking nonstop about the baby. She told me Jessica wanted her to help pick names and choose colors for the nursery. My stomach twisted, but I kept my face neutral, just nodding and saying that sounded nice. Later, I texted Serena about it, and she documented it as attempted alienation through the child. She advised me to stay neutral whenever Sophie brought up the baby or Jessica. The court-ordered parenting class started the next Tuesday, and I took the bus there after work. We learned about helping children through divorce and dealing with high-conflict custody situations. The instructor went through different scenarios, and I took notes on everything. At the break, she pulled me aside and said I was handling things remarkably well given my situation. She'd seen my intake form about the secret relationship and pregnancy during IVF treatments. By Thursday, Sophie was having accidents again, wetting the bed on transition nights. She'd wake up crying for me when she was at Chris's, and for him when she was with me. The confusion was clearly breaking her little mind, and I documented everything for Gabriel. I found a child therapist who specialized in divorce and started taking Sophie to sessions. The therapist said Sophie was showing classic signs of being caught in the middle of adult conflict. Chris filed a counter motion the following week claiming I was alienating Sophie from Jessica and the baby. He used my neutral responses to Sophie's questions as evidence that I was being hostile. Serena said this was standard tactics and helped me write responses that maintained boundaries without seeming angry. We had to be so careful with every word since everything got scrutinized in court. The judge would see my restraint as good parenting rather than alienation. I spent the next few days moving all my finances completely away from Chris's control. I opened new bank accounts at a different bank and moved my direct deposit there. Chris protested to his lawyer that I was hiding assets, but I was just protecting my paycheck. Serena reminded the court that Chris had removed me from all our joint accounts without my knowledge. The judge agreed I had every right to protect my income after what Chris had done. 2 weeks later, Gabrielle submitted her interim recommendations to the court. She supported keeping the current custody schedule, but emphasized that Sophie shouldn't be pressured to call Jessica any form of mama. Reading her report felt like validation that the situation was completely inappropriate. She wrote that introducing a pregnant girlfriend as a mother figure while the parents were still married was confusing for Sophie. She recommended that Jessica should have limited contact during transitions to reduce Sophie's confusion. The report also noted that I'd maintained stable housing and routines despite the upheaval. Chris was furious about the recommendations and sent angry messages through the parenting app. Chris showing photos of Sophie's bedroom at Jessica's makes me curious about when exactly they set all that up. Was Sophie involved, or did they just create this whole life without asking her? The timing of everything here feels really calculated somehow. He said Gabrielle didn't understand their special bond, and that Sophie loved Jessica. I screenshot everything for Serena and didn't respond to his provocations. The parenting class instructor had taught us that high-conflict people often try to bait reactions for court. I wasn't going to give him any ammunition to use against me. Sophie's accidents got worse over the next month, happening almost every transition day. The therapist said it was her way of expressing the stress she couldn't verbalize. We started using a feelings chart, and Sophie would point to confused and sad most days. It broke my heart watching my happy little girl struggle with something she couldn't understand. Chris blamed me for the regression, but the therapist documented that it happened equally at both houses. The pattern clearly showed it was related to transitions, not to either parent specifically. I found the studio apartment 3 days later, after looking at 12 different places that were either too expensive or in neighborhoods I didn't feel safe in. The property manager handed me the keys after I signed the lease and paid first month plus deposit, using most of my savings. I spent that whole weekend moving Sophie's things from the house before Chris could claim them. I carried her little bed frame up 2 flights of stairs by myself and set it up in the corner by the window. I hung her princess curtains even though they didn't match the beige walls. I arranged all her stuffed animals on the bed exactly how she liked them at home. I put her toy box against the wall and filled it with her favorite books and puzzles. I stuck glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling above her bed because she was scared of the dark. The space was tiny, but I made it as much like her real room as possible. The modification hearing happened 2 weeks later, and Gabrielle stood in front of the judge with her recommendations. The judge read through them carefully, and then looked at Chris and Jessica sitting together. She ordered that Jessica could not be called mama, or any variation of that word. She said all communication between Chris and me had to go through a court-approved co-parenting app. Chris's lawyer argued about the mama rule, but the judge cut him off and said the order stood. She also said Sophie's schedule would stay the same for now, with me having her 4 days a week. After court, I walked to my car in the parking lot when Jessica called out behind me. She said my pathetic little apartment was no place for a child while Chris stood there smirking. I pulled out my phone and opened the co-parenting app to document what she said. I typed it all in without saying a word back and walked to my car feeling proud that I didn't react. 3 days later, the mail brought a letter from my mother with her handwriting on the envelope. She wrote that she was sorry I was hurt, but she still thought Jessica was better for Sophie. She said a two-parent home with a sibling was what Sophie needed, not a broken home. I scanned the letter and sent it to Serena for our files, but didn't write back. My mother had made her choice, and I had to protect myself from more hurt. Sophie came back from Chris's house that Thursday talking nonstop about the baby shower Jessica had. She told me about all the presents the baby got and the cake shaped like a teddy bear. I remembered what Dennis taught me to say and told her how nice that the baby had everything he needed. Sophie showed me a picture on Chris's phone of her helping open presents. I smiled and said she was a good helper, even though seeing her in Jessica's living room surrounded by baby stuff made me want to scream. Gabrielle turned in her final report after 3 months of watching us at exchanges and visiting both homes. Serena called me when she got the copy and said it was mostly positive for our side. Gabrielle wrote that I maintained stable routines despite the upheaval and that Sophie was bonded to me. She noted concerns about Jessica's role and recommended clear boundaries going forward. She said equal custody was appropriate with both parents involved in major decisions. The settlement conference was scheduled for the following week in a small room at the courthouse. Chris's lawyer started by demanding primary custody, but Serena pushed back with Gabrielle's report. We went back and forth for 4 hours with the mediator trying to find middle ground. Finally, we agreed on equal custody with shared decision-making on the school, medical, and activities. Chris had to get my consent before making any big decisions about Sophie. It wasn't the full custody I wanted, but it protected Sophie from them doing whatever they wanted. Dennis helped me understand what this new reality meant during our session that week. He said I had to accept that Jessica would be in Sophie's life now, whether I liked it or not. He explained that my identity couldn't just be about being Sophie's only mother anymore. We worked on expanding how I saw myself beyond just being her primary caregiver. It was the hardest thing to accept, but he said it would get easier with time. Sophie and I had our first overnight in the studio apartment the next Friday. We built a blanket fort that took up most of the living room using every pillow and sheet we had. We had a dance party to her favorite songs and jumped on the sofa bed until we were both exhausted. She looked around our tiny space and said she liked our cozy house. We made popcorn on the hot plate and watched movies snuggled together in the fort. For the first time since everything started, I felt like maybe we would actually be okay. The temporary custody orders became official at the next court date with minor adjustments for holidays. The judge signed the papers making everything permanent while the divorce itself continued through the system. Chris looked angry when the judge confirmed equal custody instead of giving him primary. His lawyer had argued that their house was better, but the judge said both homes were suitable. I walked out knowing that at least the custody fight was over even if the divorce wasn't. 3 weeks later, my boss called me into her office for my annual performance review. She had the evaluation forms spread across her desk and started by acknowledging the difficult year I'd been through. She said despite everything happening in my personal life, I'd maintained my responsibilities and hadn't let my work suffer. She advocated for me to keep my position with continued flexibility for court dates and custody exchanges. The review secured my income and gave me stability I desperately needed. 2 months after that, Jessica's baby was born on a Tuesday morning. Sophie came back from Chris's house that Friday, subdued and clingy, not her usual bouncy self. She kept wrapping her arms around my neck and wouldn't let go. I didn't interrogate her about the baby or ask questions about how she was feeling. I just held her on the couch and let her process whatever she needed to process. She fell asleep against my shoulder and stayed there for 2 hours. The co-parenting app Serena recommended became our main communication method after that. Everything went through the app where lawyers could see it and nothing could be deleted. Chris still tried to provoke me through it, sending passive-aggressive messages about pickup times and Sophie's clothes. Having that buffer helped me respond strategically instead of emotionally like I wanted to. I could type out my angry response, delete it, then write something neutral and factual. The app documented everything which protected both of us from false claims. 6 weeks later, Dennis suggested I try one supervised therapy session with my mother for Sophie's sake. I agreed to meet her at his office with him present as mediator. We didn't reconcile or hug or cry together like in movies. We established basic guidelines for her to see Sophie during my custody time with clear boundaries. She could take Sophie to the park for 2 hours on Saturdays if she followed my rules. No mentions of Jessica or the baby, no undermining my parenting, no changing plans without permission. My mother agreed to the terms because she wanted to see Sophie. Around that time, I found an online support group for women dealing with infertility and betrayal. The group had hundreds of members who understood this specific pain of watching someone else have the baby you couldn't. Reading their stories at night helped me feel less alone. Some were years past their betrayal and doing well, which gave me hope. Others were in the thick of it like me, and we supported each other through the bad days. Sophie started thriving again once we settled into the consistent schedule. She stopped having accidents at night and slept better in both houses. She still talked about the baby sometimes, showing me pictures Chris took on his phone, but she was equally excited about our activities like making cookies or going to the library. She seemed secure having 2 homes even if it wasn't ideal. The months passed with exchanges at daycare and messages through the app. Summer turned to fall and then winter came with its own challenges about holidays. We negotiated through lawyers who would have Sophie for Thanksgiving and Christmas morning. Every decision required documentation and agreement from both sides. At the 1-year mark from when everything started, we had our final custody hearing. The judge reviewed all the reports and documentation from the past year. She made minor adjustments for holidays and school breaks, but kept the equal custody arrangement. Chris and Jessica sat on the other side of the courtroom as just co-parents I had to deal with now. They weren't the family that replaced me anymore, just people I had to coordinate schedules with. The judge signed the final papers making everything permanent. That night, Sophie asked me to read her favorite book about a little rabbit who gets lost and finds his way home. The timing of Jessica's baby being born right when custody became official feels oddly convenient. Makes me wonder if Chris planned planned this whole timeline from the start? Sophie coming back subdued and clingy after meeting the baby tells me more than any words could about what she's really feeling in that house right now. She wanted me to read it 3 times in a row, snuggling closer with each reading. As she fell asleep against my shoulder in our tiny studio apartment, her breath warm against my neck, I had a moment of clarity. I looked around at our small space with her drawings taped to the walls and her toys in the corner. This wasn't the life I'd planned or the family I'd wanted, but I hadn't lost everything like I'd thought that first terrible night. I'd kept the most important part right here in my arms. Sophie and I were building something new together in this little studio, something that was just ours. No one could take this away from us. Well, that's it from me. Thanks for letting me wonder about all this with you folks. Hope you enjoyed my curious thoughts along the way. Until we meet again. And hey, like the video. It helps more than you think.